She was only the quiet waitress, the one nobody noticed, until she leaned toward the Mafia boss's father and let a single Sicily greeting slip out in a soft, flawless cadence. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The syllables landed like a match in dry air, and every conversation in the room died mid-breath. Glasses hovered inches from lips. Chairs stopped creaking. Even the music seemed to shrink away. The old man's eyes narrowed, searching her face for a name, a memory, a warning. The boss's smile froze, not with anger but with recognition, because some words don't just say hello. They say, "I know where you're from. I know what you've buried." The crystal chandeliers of Il Velluto cast amber shadows across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, each surface reflecting the quiet desperation of perfection. The scent of white truffles and aged Barolo hung in the air, mingling with the nervous sweat of staff who moved like ghosts through the dining room. Tonight was different. Tonight, the Carbone family would dine here. Matteo Galli adjusted his silk tie for the 7th time in 10 minutes, his fingers trembling against the midnight blue fabric. The restaurant manager's usual military precision had cracked into something raw and anxious. He surveyed his kingdom, every napkin folded to razor sharpness, every wine glass positioned with mathematical accuracy, but his dark eyes betrayed a fear that went deeper than professional failure. "Signore Galli," a waiter approached with hushed reverence. "The flowers for table 7. Perfect, they must be perfect." Matteo's voice carried the weight of a man who understood that imperfection tonight meant more than lost revenue. His hands smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from the tablecloth, then paused, his gaze distant. Something in his posture suggested he was remembering another night, another moment when perfection had shattered. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing a cloud of steam scented with rosemary and sea salt. Among the servers emerged Bianca Rinaldi, 23 years old, her movements fluid, yet deliberately unremarkable. She wore the standard black uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck. But there was something carefully hidden in the way she held herself, a grace too refined for her station, hands too soft for years of service work. "Bianca?" Matteo's voice cut through the ambient chatter. She turned, and for a moment, her green eyes held his with an intensity that seemed to recognize something unspoken. "You will serve only water tonight. Table 7. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not draw attention." She nodded, but something flickered across her features, not submission, but calculation. "Understood, signore." The front doors opened with a whisper of cold Manhattan air, and the restaurant fell into a silence so complete that the soft classical music seemed to amplify rather than fill it. Marcello Carbone entered first, his silver hair immaculate, his charcoal suit cut with the precision of old money. Behind him walked his son, Nico, Il Lupo, the wolf, whose presence transformed the space into something predatory. Nico Carbone moved through the world as if it existed solely for his judgment. His dark eyes swept the room with the methodical attention of a hunter cataloguing prey. When a young waiter's cologne proved too assertive for his taste, Nico's displeasure manifested as a single raised eyebrow that sent the man scrambling toward the staff quarters, face burning with humiliation. Matteo stepped forward, his bow precise, but not servile. "Patriarch Carbone, the honor is ours." Marcello's weathered face remained impassive as he surveyed the restaurant with the air of a man who had never encountered anything he couldn't own or destroy. The weight of his attention settled on each detail like a judgment. When his gaze briefly met Matteo's, something passed between them, a flicker of recognition that Matteo quickly shuttered. "The usual table," Marcello commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to repetition. As they moved toward the private dining area, Nico's attention caught on Bianca, who stood motionless by the water station. She had perfected the art of invisibility, but something about her stillness drew his predatory focus. Perhaps it was the way she didn't shrink under his gaze, or the subtle straightening of her spine that suggested a backbone hidden beneath compliance. The evening air thickened with tension as father and son took their seats at the corner table, positioned to command views of both the restaurant and the street beyond. Their conversation began in low tones, punctuated by the careful choreography of servers who understood that tonight, even breathing too loudly could prove catastrophic. Bianca approached with a crystal pitcher of San Pellegrino, her steps measured and silent. As she poured, fragments of their conversation drifted past the soft jazz, words like loyalty, territory, and consequences that painted pictures of a world where power was currency and weakness was death. But as she moved between the tables, something in Nico's expression had shifted from boredom to a sharper interest. The way she held the pitcher, the unconscious elegance of her posture, the fact that she hadn't once fumbled under his scrutiny, all of it suggested a performance rather than nature. When their eyes met for the second time that evening, Nico's smile was slow and dangerous, the expression of a man who had just realized the evening might prove more entertaining than anticipated. In that moment, both predator and prey understood that the game had begun, though neither yet grasped that they had misjudged who was hunting whom. Welcome, viewer. We're glad you're here. Tap like and comment below what you thought of the story and what city you're watching from right now. Back to the story. The dining room of Il Veluto existed in a state of orchestrated perfection that bordered on the surreal. Soft light from Italian crystal fixtures cast everything in honey tones, while the scent of aged parmesan and fresh basil mingled with undertones of expensive leather and cologne. The marble floors had been polished to mirror brightness, reflecting the careful ballet of servers who moved like shadows between tables draped in cream silk. Bianca had learned the unspoken laws of this world within her first week. Don't look directly at the guests. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist in any way that might disturb the illusion of effortless luxury. The staff were meant to be invisible, extensions of the restaurant's machinery, rather than human beings with thoughts and histories. In the kitchen, the heat was different. Where the dining room maintained its cool elegance, the kitchen blazed with the controlled chaos of haute cuisine. Chef Benedetto commanded his domain with the precision of a conductor, his voice cutting through the sizzle of sautéing garlic and the rhythmic chop of knives against cutting boards. The air was thick with steam that carried the perfume of roasting meat and fresh herbs. "Table 7 needs their antipasti in 3 minutes, the sous chef called out, his accent thick with regional Italian that reminded Bianca of childhood lullabies. She pushed the memory down, focusing instead on the immediate demands of service. The other servers moved around her with practiced efficiency, but Bianca noticed the way conversations died when certain names were mentioned. The Carbone family cast a shadow that extended far beyond their table, influencing even the kitchen staff who would never see their faces. Fear had a smell here, sharp and metallic, cutting through the rich aromas of the evening's menu. "Bianca," Matteo appeared beside her, his presence sudden and tense. Up close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was watching. "Remember what I told you. Water only. Nothing more." But his eyes told a different story. There was something desperate in the way he looked at her, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't trust the words to remain between them. Bianca nodded, studying his face for clues to the anxiety that radiated from him, like heat from an oven. The dining room felt different when she returned to it. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. At table 7, Marcello Carbone sat with the absolute stillness of a man who had never learned to fidget. His presence commanded the space around him, turning the elegant restaurant into his personal court. Nico occupied his chair differently, sprawled with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered real consequences. He watched the other diners with lazy interest, cataloguing their conversations and interactions with the attention of a predator studying prey. When his gaze settled on the young couple at table 12, their animated discussion about a Broadway show died mid-sentence. The rules of Il Veluto were simple. The wealthy came here to feel powerful, and the staff existed to enable that illusion. But tonight, with the Carbones present, those rules felt more like survival instructions. Bianca moved between tables with heightened awareness, noting the way other servers gave table 7 a wider berth than necessary, how even the sommelier's hands trembled slightly as he approached with wine selections. The texture of the evening was wrong. Usually, Il Veluto hummed with the comfortable noise of wealth at leisure. the clink of crystal, the murmur of cultivated conversation, the soft laughter of people who had never known genuine fear. Tonight, those sounds felt muffled, as if the very air was holding its breath. From her position by the water station, Bianca could observe the intricate dance of power that played out at table 7. Marcello spoke in measured tones that required his son to lean forward to catch every word. Nico's responses were equally quiet, but there was tension in the line of his shoulders that suggested their conversation wasn't entirely pleasant. She refilled water glasses with mechanical precision, her training taking over while her mind processed the subtle signals around her. The way Matteo hovered near the kitchen doors, ready to intervene if needed. How the other diners seemed to eat more quickly than usual, as if eager to leave. The manner in which the restaurant's usual ambient energy had contracted into something tight and expectant. The evening light outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had deepened to purple, casting the dining room in a more intimate glow. But intimacy felt dangerous here tonight. Every whispered conversation might be overheard, every gesture might be misinterpreted, every glance might be taken as judgment or challenge. Bianca understood that she existed in this space by virtue of her ability to remain unseen. The crisp white shirt and black slacks were more than uniform. They were camouflage. The carefully neutral expression she wore was armor. The way she held her body, neither too confident nor too submissive, was a calculated performance designed to trigger no one's interest or suspicion. But as she moved through her practiced routine, she felt the weight of observation. Someone was watching her with more attention than her position warranted, studying her movements with the intensity of someone looking for cracks in a facade. When she finally allowed herself to glance toward table 7, she met Nico's dark gaze directly. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, neither looked away. In that suspended instant, Bianca realized that her carefully constructed invisibility might not be as complete as she had believed, and that tonight, being seen could prove more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The first course arrived with military precision, delicate crudo di tonno, arranged like abstract art on bone china plates. Bianca watched from her station as the servers moved in practiced formation, each dish placed with the reverence reserved for religious artifacts. The dining room maintained its cathedral silence, broken only by the soft percussion of silverware against porcelain. Then Marcello Carbone took his first bite. The old patriarch chewed slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing. But something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that sent ripples of tension through the air. His dark eyes found Chef Benedetto, who had emerged from the kitchen to observe the service, and in that gaze was the promise of judgment. "This is garbage," Marcello's voice cut through the hushed atmosphere like a blade. "Fake ingredients, inferior fish masquerading as quality." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Bianca felt the collective intake of breath from the staff, saw the way Matteo's face drained of color. In the world of Il Veluto, such a declaration wasn't merely criticism, it was devastation. Chef Benedetto stepped forward, his chef's whites pristine, but his hands trembling slightly. "Patriarch Carbone, I assure you—" "Assurance?" Marcello's laugh was devoid of humor. "I've eaten in every fine establishment from Palermo to Manhattan. This is not bluefin tuna. This is not Ligurian olive oil. Do you take me for a fool?" Nico leaned back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with the lazy interest of someone attending a particularly violent theater performance. His fingers drummed against the white tablecloth in a rhythm that suggested anticipation rather than boredom. Matteo moved forward, his usual composure cracking under pressure. "Perhaps if we could discuss—" "No discussion." Marcello's attention swept the dining room before settling on Bianca with predatory focus. "You, the girl with the water." Every eye in the restaurant turned toward her. Bianca felt her carefully constructed invisibility shatter like glass, leaving her exposed under the harsh spotlight of the patriarch's attention. She approached the table with measured steps, her training warring with instincts that screamed at her to run. "You will taste this," Marcello commanded, gesturing toward the offending dish, "and you will tell this kitchen what they have done wrong." The request was impossible. A server, especially one relegated to water service, didn't possess the palate or authority to judge haute cuisine. But refusal wasn't an option when Marcello Carbone made a demand. Bianca lifted the fork with steady hands, aware that every person in the restaurant was watching her perform what amounted to professional suicide. She took a small bite, letting the flavors settle on her tongue, while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. The fish was indeed bluefin, but not from the Mediterranean as claimed. The olive oil carried the subtle earthiness of Tuscan groves rather than Ligurian coastal production. The blood orange reduction was authentic Sicilian, its color and acidity unmistakable to someone who had grown up with such flavors. "The tuna is Pacific bluefin, not Mediterranean," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding tables. "The olive oil is Tuscan, perhaps from Maremma, good quality but not what was promised." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen noise seemed to halt, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Marcello's eyes narrowed, studying her with new intensity. "And how," he said slowly, "does a water girl know such things?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Bianca felt the weight of 24 stares, but it was Nico's gaze that held her attention. His previous lazy interest had sharpened into something predatory and calculating. She began, then stopped. Any explanation would reveal too much, but silence might prove equally dangerous. "You speak with authority," Nico interjected, his voice carrying a note of amusement that didn't reach his eyes. "Almost as if you learned such distinctions at someone's table rather than from serving them." Bianca's pulse quickened. She had made a mistake, not in her assessment, which was accurate, but in revealing knowledge that her position couldn't possibly justify. A water girl didn't develop such refined palate through professional experience. "My family," she said carefully. "We cooked together. My grandmother was particular about ingredients." It was partial truth wrapped in necessary deception, but Nico's smile suggested he found her explanation as suspect as she intended it to sound convincing. "Interesting." Marcello leaned back, his attention still focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, girl, what's your name?" "Bianca Stone, sir." "Stone." He repeated the name as if testing its authenticity. "And how long have you worked at Il Velluto?" 3 months, sir." 3 months, and already you possess expertise that embarrasses our chef." Marcello's gaze shifted to Chef Benedetto, whose face had darkened with a mixture of humiliation and anger. "Perhaps the kitchen staff should take lessons from the water service." The insult landed with precision, designed to wound both the chef's pride and professional reputation. But Bianca realized that she had become the unwitting instrument of that humiliation, transformed from invisible server into weapon against the kitchen staff. "I meant no disrespect," she said quickly. "I was only honest." Nico's voice cut across her apology with silky menace. "How refreshing. So few people dare honesty in my presence." His words carried layers of meaning that made her skin prickle. This wasn't praise. It was the acknowledgement of someone who had just become infinitely more interesting to a man who found entertainment in dangerous games. "You will join us for the remainder of the meal," Marcello declared with the casual authority of someone unaccustomed to refusal. "I'm curious to hear your assessment of the other courses." The invitation was a command disguised as courtesy, and Bianca understood that her evening of careful invisibility had just transformed into something far more treacherous. As she looked into Nico's dark eyes, she saw the glitter of a predator who had just discovered that his prey might bite back. A chair materialized beside table 7, as if summoned by Marcello's will alone. Bianca found herself seated between father and son, her black uniform a stark contrast to their tailored elegance. The proximity felt dangerous. She could smell Nico's cologne, something dark and expensive that reminded her of winter nights and predatory patience. The second course arrived with renewed urgency from the kitchen. Chef Benedetto had clearly taken Marcello's criticism as a personal declaration of war. The risotto e porcini was plated with mathematical precision, each grain distinct, the wild mushrooms arranged like tiny sculptures across the creamy surface. "Well?" Marcello gestured toward the plate with the casual authority of a Roman emperor deciding gladiator fates. "Enlighten us." Bianca lifted the fork, aware that every movement was being analyzed. The risotto was technically perfect, the rice al dente, the mushrooms earthy and rich. But there was something else, a subtle note that didn't belong. "The porcini are beautiful," she said carefully, "but there's truffle oil in the preparation. It masks the natural flavor of the mushrooms." Nico leaned closer, his attention sharpening. "You can taste the difference? Truffle oil has a synthetic quality. Real truffle is more earthy, complex." She paused, realizing she was speaking with more confidence than her position warranted. "This is still excellent, just different from traditional preparation." "Traditional," Marcello repeated, as if the word held particular significance. "And where did you learn about traditional preparation, Bianca Stone?" The name felt wrong in his mouth, as if he was testing its authenticity with each syllable. Bianca felt the weight of both men's attention like physical pressure against her skin. "My nonna," she said, the lie mixing with truth in ways that felt dangerous. She was very particular about authentic flavors. Was she Italian? Nico's question carried casual interest, but his dark eyes were calculating. Yes. Another truth buried in deception. From where? The question hung in the air like a trap. Bianca's mind raced through safe responses, regions that wouldn't trigger recognition or suspicion. But before she could answer, something made her pause. There was something in Nico's tone, a quality that suggested he already suspected the truth. "Sicilia," she said quietly, then immediately regretted the admission. Nico's smile was slow and predatory. "Interesting. Which province?" "Palermo." The word escaped before she could stop it, carrying with it the faint accent of childhood, the way her father had taught her to pronounce their homeland with pride and reverence. "Ah." Marcello's voice carried new interest. "And what was your nonna's family name?" The question was a minefield. Any name she gave could be traced, verified, or worse, recognized, but silence would be equally damning. "Russo," she said, choosing the most common surname she could remember. Russo. Nico tasted the name like wine. A large family in Palermo, many branches. His fingers drummed against the table in that same predatory rhythm. "Tell me, what part of the city?" Bianca felt sweat gather at the base of her neck, despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. Each question pushed her deeper into dangerous territory, but retreat was impossible with both men watching her like hawks studying wounded prey. "Near the cathedral," she said, hoping the tourist area would be vague enough to avoid specific verification. "The Quattro Canti." Nico's voice carried a note of amusement. "How conventional." There was something mocking in his tone that made her spine stiffen. Without thinking, she responded in rapid Sicilian, the words flowing with the fluid pronunciation of someone raised with the dialect. "Chi nesci rila, nesci cu rispettu." Who leaves there, leaves with respect. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to halt, as if her words had created a vacuum in the air. Marcello's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, while Nico's expression shifted from amusement to sharp, predatory focus. "Interesting," Marcello said slowly, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "That's not tourist Sicilian, girl. That's old dialect, noble dialect." Bianca felt the blood drain from her face. She had made a catastrophic error, allowing emotion to override caution. The words had emerged with the accent and phrasing of aristocratic families, the way her father had spoken when he wanted to remind someone of their heritage. She began, but found no safe explanation. "My father is right," Nico said, his voice soft with dangerous interest. "That's not the accent of cathedral tourists or common families. That's the pronunciation of old blood, ancient families." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with new intensity. "Tell me, Bianca Stone, what other surprises are you hiding?" The question felt like a knife pressed against her throat. She met his gaze directly, seeing recognition dawn in his dark eyes. He knew she was lying. Worse, he was beginning to suspect the magnitude of her deception. "I should return to my duties," she said quietly, starting to rise. "Sit." Marcello's command was soft but absolute. "We're just getting acquainted." As she settled back into her chair, Bianca realized that what had begun as a dangerous test had evolved into something far more treacherous. She was no longer just a server who had revealed unexpected knowledge. She was a puzzle that had captured the attention of two of the most dangerous men in the city. And puzzles, she knew, were meant to be solved. The third course arrived in the charged atmosphere like an offering to volatile gods. Osso buco alla Milanese, the marrow-rich veal shank glazed to perfection, accompanied by saffron risotto that glowed like captured sunlight. The aroma rose between them, rich, complex, layered with wine and herbs that spoke of hours of patient preparation. Nico gestured toward the plate with theatrical elegance. "Please, continue your education of our palate." But this felt different from the previous tests. He had moved his chair closer, ostensibly to better observe her reactions, but the proximity created an intimacy that made her pulse quicken. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, catch the subtle notes of his cologne mixing with the food's fragrance. Bianca cut into the veal with surgical precision, aware that her handling of the knife revealed more training than a casual cook should possess. The meat fell away from the bone in perfect portions, the marrow glistening like dark jewels in their centers. "The saffron is Kashmiri," she said after tasting, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not Spanish, more delicate, with floral notes that complement rather than overwhelm the veal." Marcello nodded slowly. "Expensive choice. Most restaurants use Spanish saffron and assume their customers won't know the difference." "This chef respects his ingredients," Bianca replied, then caught herself. She was speaking again with too much authority, as if she had experience judging high-end kitchens rather than serving in them. "And you respect his choices?" Nico's question carried undertones that had nothing to do with food. His dark eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Or do you simply recognize quality when you encounter it?" The double meaning in his words made her skin prickle. This was no longer about culinary assessment. It was becoming something far more dangerous, a game where each exchange revealed more than she intended to show. "I appreciate craft," she said carefully, "whether it's cooking, wine, or—" She paused, realizing she was about to mention skills that had no place in a server's background. "Or—" Nico leaned closer, his voice dropping to a register that seemed meant for her ears alone. "What other crafts capture your appreciation, Bianca Stone?" The way he spoke her assumed name made it clear he found it as authentic as costume jewelry. But there was something else in his tone, a note of genuine curiosity that suggested his interest went beyond mere suspicion. "Music," she said, choosing the safest truth she could offer. "My family valued music." "What instrument?" "Piano." Another dangerous admission, but lies were becoming impossible to maintain under his relentless attention. "Classical training." "Some." The word carried the weight of years of study, of teachers who had recognized natural talent and pushed her toward perfection her father had insisted upon. Marcello had been listening with the patience of a predator, but now he interjected with casual menace. "Play for us." Bianca felt the blood freeze in her veins. "I'm sorry. There's a piano in the private dining room upstairs," Marcello continued, his weathered features revealing nothing of his true intentions. "If you truly have training, demonstrate it." The request was impossible to refuse and equally impossible to fulfill safely. Any demonstration of her musical ability would reveal years of expensive education, the kind of training available only to families of means and status. But refusal would confirm their growing suspicions about her deception. "I haven't played in months," she said quietly. "I'm not sure—" "We're not asking for Carnegie Hall," Nico interrupted, but his smile carried predatory amusement. "Just a simple demonstration, to satisfy our curiosity." She found herself rising from the table, following them toward the private elevator that led to Il Veluto's exclusive upper level. The space was more intimate than the main dining room, leather banquettes arranged around a baby grand piano that gleamed like black water under crystal chandeliers. As her fingers touched the keys, muscle memory took over. She had intended to play something simple, amateurish, but instead found herself beginning Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The melody flowed from her hands with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting every phrase, every delicate ornament. The music filled the intimate space with haunting beauty, each note carrying emotional weight that she hadn't intended to reveal. She was no longer Bianca Stone, the invisible server. She was herself, complete and unguarded, pouring years of training and passion into the elegant composition. When the last note faded into silence, she looked up to find both men watching her with expressions of sharp calculation. The beautiful melody had been a confession more damning than any words. Conservatory training, Marcello observed quietly. Years of it. Expensive years. Nico moved behind the piano bench, close enough that she could feel his presence like heat against her back. "Tell me," he said softly, "what other lies have you told us tonight?" His hands came to rest on either side of the piano bench, effectively trapping her between his arms. The position was predatory but not aggressive, a demonstration of control rather than threat. When she turned to face him, their faces were inches apart. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice carrying the soft menace of someone accustomed to answers. Bianca met his gaze directly, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. In that moment, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. "What makes you think I've been lying?" she asked quietly, allowing just enough challenge into her voice to suggest that the game might not be as one-sided as he assumed. Nico's smile was slow and dangerous. "Because, cara mia, I recognize my own kind, and you, whatever your name really is, are definitely not what you pretend to be." The tension in the private dining room shattered like crystal against marble as Matteo burst through the doors, his usual composure completely abandoned. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature, and his hands trembled as he clutched a manila envelope against his chest. "Patriarch Carbone," he gasped, his voice raw with panic. "There's been a development. An urgent development." Nico straightened slowly, his predatory focus shifting from Bianca to the restaurant manager with laser intensity. "What kind of development requires interrupting a private conversation?" Matteo's eyes darted between the three of them, lingering on Bianca with an expression she couldn't decipher. Fear, recognition, something deeper and more complex. "There are reporters downstairs, Channel 7 news crew. They're asking about historical connections." "Historical connections to what?" Marcello's voice carried the deadly calm of a man who had weathered countless storms but recognized the approach of a hurricane. "To the restaurant, to previous ownership, they mentioned." Matteo's voice cracked, forcing him to swallow hard before continuing. "They mentioned the Rinaldi family." The name hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Bianca felt the blood drain from her face so quickly that she gripped the piano bench to keep from swaying. Across the room, she caught Marcello's sharp intake of breath, saw the way his weathered hands clenched into fists. "The Rinaldi family," Nico repeated slowly, his voice carrying a note of dangerous interest. "And what, precisely, are they asking about the Rinaldis?" "About the property acquisition 10 years ago, about whether there were any irregularities in the transfer of ownership, about families that disappeared from the public record around the same time." Matteo pulled a tablet from the envelope, his fingers shaking as he activated the screen. "It's worse than questions. Someone leaked documents to them. Financial records, property deeds, testimonies from—" He paused, his voice breaking completely. "From survivors." The word survivors hit Bianca like a physical blow. Her vision blurred momentarily, and she found herself transported back to smoke and screams, to the weight of her father's hands, pushing her toward a hidden passage, as flames consumed everything they had built. "Show me," Marcello commanded, his authority cutting through the charged atmosphere. The tablet screen displayed a news website, the headline bold and damning. "Vanished Families Investigation into Suspicious Property Transfers Reveals Pattern of Intimidation." Below it, a photograph that made Bianca's heart stop, her father Alessandro Rinaldi, in a formal portrait that must have been taken months before his death. But it wasn't just the photograph that terrified her, it was the byline. Investigative report by Maria Santos, with documentation provided by anonymous sources within the hospitality industry. Anonymous sources, Nico said softly, but his voice carried the promise of violence. How convenient. Bianca forced herself to focus on the immediate threat rather than the memories clawing at her consciousness. Someone had been gathering information, building a case, waiting for the right moment to strike. The timing of this revelation, coinciding with the Carboni family's presence at Il Veluto, couldn't be coincidental. So there's more, Matteo continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They're requesting interviews with current staff. They want to speak with anyone who might have knowledge of the transition period. And what did you tell them? Marcello's question carried the weight of a man accustomed to absolute loyalty. Nothing. But they're not leaving. They've set up equipment outside, and they're interviewing customers as they exit, making it impossible to ignore. Bianca felt the walls closing in around her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear before the investigation could uncover her true identity. But Nico's presence behind her felt like a cage, his attention like chains holding her in place. Interesting timing, Nico observed, his voice deceptively casual. A story about the Rinaldi family surfaces on the same night we discover a server with noble Sicilian dialect and conservatory training. The implication in his words made her skin crawl. He was connecting dots, drawing conclusions that would prove fatal if allowed to reach their logical end. You think there's a connection? Marcello asked, but his eyes were already studying Bianca with renewed intensity. I think, Nico said slowly, moving around the piano bench to face her directly, that coincidences are usually anything but coincidental. Through the private dining room's windows, Bianca could see the news crew's lights casting harsh illumination across the street below. Camera operators and reporters moved with professional efficiency, turning Il Veluto into the center of a media storm that would attract attention from far more dangerous quarters than television journalism. The story goes live in 1 hour, Matteo said quietly. They're broadcasting a special report at 11. 1 hour, 60 minutes before her carefully constructed invisibility would be shattered beyond repair, before questions about the Rinaldi family would draw the attention of everyone who had been involved in their destruction. We need to leave, Marcello declared, rising from his chair with the decisive movement of a man accustomed to strategic retreats. Now. But as they moved toward the elevator, Nico's hand closed around Bianca's wrist with gentle but implacable force. His touch was warm, almost protective, but she understood the message. She would not be leaving alone. You're coming with us, he said quietly, his voice carrying both command and something that might have been concern. For your own protection. Through the elevator's glass walls as they descended, Bianca could see the news crew's equipment and the gathering crowd of curious onlookers. In less than an hour, the name Rinaldi would be broadcast across the city, opening wounds that had been carefully cauterized and hidden, and she would be trapped in the center of the storm, her true identity balanced on the edge of a knife held by the very people who had destroyed her family. The black Mercedes moved through Manhattan's late-night traffic like a predator navigating familiar hunting grounds. Bianca sat between Nico and Marcello, the leather seats soft as silk, but feeling like restraints around her body. Through tinted windows, she watched the city lights blur past, each one taking her further from any possibility of escape. The car smelled of expensive cologne and something darker, the metallic tang of power exercised without conscience. Marcello spoke in low tones to someone on his phone, his words a mixture of Italian and English that painted pictures of damage control and strategic maneuvering. Cancel the Torino meeting, he commanded. Reschedule the harbor inspection. And find out who leaked those documents before I lose my patience entirely. Nico sat with predatory stillness beside her, his attention focused on the tablet displaying the news story. The screen's glow illuminated his sharp features as he scrolled through details that made Bianca's blood run cold. They have property records, he said quietly, detailed financial transactions. Someone provided them with documentation that should have been destroyed years ago. His dark eyes found hers in the reflection of the window. Tell me, Cara, do you know anything about document preservation, about families who might keep records of historical injustices? The question was a trap wrapped in silk, but Bianca understood that any answer would be dangerous. I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't. His smile carried no warmth. "Just as you don't know why a server at Il Veluto speaks noble Sicilian and plays Chopin like a conservatory graduate." The car turned onto Fifth Avenue, heading toward an address that Bianca recognized with growing dread. The Carbone family compound occupied an entire block of the Upper East Side, hidden behind stone walls and wrought iron gates that looked decorative but were reinforced with modern security technology. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Somewhere safe," Marcello replied without looking up from his phone. "The news story will attract attention from people far less civilized than journalists. If you're truly innocent, you'll appreciate our protection." The word innocent carried layers of meaning that made her stomach clench. She understood that she was being evaluated, tested, that her responses would determine whether she left this car as a protected guest or something far more permanent. The gates opened silently as they approached, revealing a courtyard dominated by a fountain that looked transplanted from a Roman villa. The mansion beyond was imposing without being ostentatious, old money architecture that spoke of power accumulated over generations. Security personnel materialized from shadows as they exited the car, their presence professional, but unmistakably threatening. Bianca noticed how they moved, the way their eyes swept the perimeter with practiced efficiency. These were not ordinary bodyguards. "Welcome to our home," Nico said as they climbed marble steps toward massive oak doors. "I hope you'll find your stay enlightening." The interior was a study in controlled elegance. Persian rugs covered polished marble floors, while oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched from gilded frames. The air carried the scent of old wood and beeswax, mingling with something floral that couldn't quite mask an underlying tension. "You'll stay in the East Wing," Marcello announced as they entered a receiving room dominated by a fireplace large enough to roast an entire animal. Comfortable accommodations, excellent meals, and absolute security. "And if I want to leave?" Bianca asked, though she suspected the answer. "Why would you want to leave?" Nico's voice carried genuine curiosity. "Outside these walls, you're vulnerable to whoever orchestrated tonight's media ambush. Here you're under the protection of the Carbone family." Protection. The word felt like chains around her throat. She understood that she had become a prisoner disguised as a guest, trapped by circumstances that had spiraled beyond her control. A woman emerged from the shadows of the grand staircase, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her clothing was expensive but understated, and her dark eyes held the same predatory intelligence as her male relatives. "Our guest," she said, her voice carrying cultured authority. "How unexpected." "Luciana," Nico acknowledged with a slight nod. "May I present Bianca Stone, who will be staying with us for a few days." Luciana's gaze swept over Bianca with the thoroughness of an appraiser evaluating a potentially valuable but suspect acquisition. Stone. Such a common name. The emphasis she placed on common made it clear that she found nothing common about their unexpected guest. This woman had already begun the process of evaluation, searching for weaknesses and contradictions that could be exploited. "I've prepared the blue suite," Luciana continued, her attention returning to her father and brother, "though I wonder if our guest might prefer accommodations that better reflect her background." Another test, another trap. Bianca understood that everything from her response to room assignments to her table manners would be scrutinized for clues to her true identity. "The blue suite will be perfect," she said quietly, hoping to avoid further interrogation. But Luciana's smile suggested that avoidance would not be possible. "Excellent. I look forward to getting to know you better, Miss Stone. We have so much to discuss." As they climbed the curved staircase toward the East Wing, Bianca caught sight of security monitors displaying feeds from throughout the compound. The images showed guards patrolling the perimeter, sophisticated alarm systems, and barriers that would make escape nearly impossible. At the door to her assigned suite, Nico paused with his hand on the ornate handle. "Rest well, Kara. Tomorrow we'll continue our conversation about your background, your family, and the remarkable coincidences that brought you into our lives." His voice carried the promise of interrogation disguised as courtesy. As the door closed behind her, Bianca heard the soft click of an electronic lock engaging. She was trapped in luxury, surrounded by people who had destroyed her family, playing a game where discovery meant death. Through tall windows, she could see Manhattan's skyline glittering like scattered diamonds, each light representing a life of freedom she might never experience again. Tomorrow would bring new tests, deeper questions, and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed disguise was crumbling piece by piece. In the distance, she could hear the low murmur of voices as the Carbone family discussed their unexpected guest and planned her future, a future that would depend entirely on how well she could continue to hide the truth of who she really was. Dawn filtered through the tall windows of the blue suite, casting everything in shades of pearl and gold. Bianca had barely slept, her mind racing through possible escape routes and cover stories, while her body remained tense against silk sheets that felt more like spider webs. Every luxury in the room, from the antique armoire to the fresh orchids on the writing desk, served as a reminder that she was a guest who could become a prisoner at any moment. A soft knock interrupted her restless thoughts. She expected a servant, perhaps breakfast, but instead found Nico standing in the doorway with 2 cups of espresso and an expression of calculated casualness that set her nerves on edge. "Buongiorno," he said, entering without invitation. "I thought you might appreciate authentic coffee after a difficult night." He was dressed more casually than the previous evening, charcoal slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled back, revealing forearms marked with a thin scar that disappeared beneath his cuff. The informal attire made him seem younger, more approachable. But Bianca understood this was another mask, another tool in whatever game he intended to play. "Thank you," she said carefully, accepting the cup while maintaining distance. The espresso was perfect, rich, aromatic, with the slight bitterness that spoke of quality beans and expert preparation. "Cuban beans," Nico observed, watching her reaction with those dark, calculating eyes. "Roasted by a family in Little Italy who've been perfecting their technique for 4 generations. Tell me, can you taste the difference?" Another test. Every conversation with him became an interrogation disguised as polite interest. "It's very good," she replied neutrally. "Just good?" He moved to the windows, gazing out at the courtyard, where morning light illuminated the fountain's spray. "Someone with your palate, someone who can distinguish Kashmiri saffron from Spanish, who recognizes truffle oil masquerading as authentic flavor. Surely you can appreciate the subtleties of properly roasted coffee." His tone was conversational, but she heard the trap underlying his words. He was building a case, collecting evidence of sophistication that contradicted her humble background. "I appreciate quality when I encounter it," she said, echoing her words from the previous night. "And you encounter it often?" He turned from the window, his attention laser-focused on her face. "For a server who's been working at Il Veluto for only 3 months." "I observe. I learn." "You learn quickly." He moved closer, not threatening but persistent. "Remarkably quickly for someone with your supposed background." Bianca felt the walls of her deception closing in. Every answer led to more questions, each response revealing contradictions she couldn't adequately explain. "Tell me about your hands," Nico said suddenly, his voice dropping to an intimate register that made her pulse quicken. "My hands, they're beautiful hands, soft, well-maintained, not the hands of someone who spent years in service work." He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "When I touched your wrist last night, I noticed they're not calloused from carrying trays or roughened from washing dishes." The observation was accurate and damning. She had tried to disguise her hands with cheap nail polish and deliberate neglect, but months of manual labor couldn't erase years of careful maintenance. "I use lotion," she said weakly. "Expensive lotion, apparently." His smile was predatory, but not cruel. "And your posture. You carry yourself like someone accustomed to being watched, to being the center of attention. That's not the bearing of someone who spent her life invisible." He was circling her like a wolf studying wounded prey, identifying each weakness with methodical precision. But there was something else in his attention, a quality she couldn't quite identify, that felt less like interrogation and more like genuine curiosity. "What happened to your family, Bianca?" The question struck like a physical blow, direct and unexpected. She felt color drain from her face before she could control her reaction. "I told you. You told me lies." His voice was gentle, but implacable. "Your grandmother, your supposed background in Palermo, the tourist stories about the cathedral district, all carefully constructed fabrications." He moved to the writing desk, his fingers trailing across its polished surface as he spoke. "But the music wasn't a lie. The Chopin you played last night, that was real, raw, emotional. That was you, not your character." Bianca's throat constricted. He had identified the exact moment when her disguise had cracked, when genuine emotion had overwhelmed careful deception. "Who taught you to play like that?" he continued, his voice carrying unexpected gentleness. "Someone who loved you, someone who saw talent and nurtured it, someone who's no longer in your life." The words hit too close to truth, awakening memories she had spent years trying to bury. Her father's hands guiding hers across the keys, his voice encouraging her to find the emotion beneath the technique, the way he would smile when she mastered a particularly difficult passage. "Stop," she whispered. "Your accent when you spoke Sicilian, that wasn't learned from tourists or common families. That was aristocratic pronunciation, the way old blood speaks when they want to remind you of their heritage." He was building towards something, connecting pieces of a puzzle she couldn't let him complete. Each observation brought him closer to the truth that would destroy her. "And the way you assessed the food last night, you weren't guessing. You have a trained palate, educated taste. Someone invested considerable time and money in your culinary education." "Please stop. The timing of your appearance at Il Veluto, just months before someone decides to investigate the Rinaldi family disappearance. The coincidence of a server with noble Sicilian dialect being present when that story breaks." His voice was soft now, almost hypnotic, as he laid out the evidence of her deception piece by methodical piece. "Tell me who you really are," he said, moving close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Tell me what happened to your family. Tell me why you're afraid." Bianca looked into his dark eyes and saw something unexpected, not triumph at having cornered his prey, but something that might have been understanding. For a moment she was tempted to let the truth spill out, to share the weight she had carried alone for so long. But then she remembered the screams, the smoke, the way her father's eyes had looked when he pushed her toward the hidden passage. She remembered that this man, however gentle his current demeanor, was part of the family that had destroyed everything she had ever loved. "I'm exactly who I told you I am," she said quietly, meeting his gaze with all the strength she could muster. "And if you think otherwise, you're going to have to prove it." Nico's smile was slow and appreciative. "Challenge accepted, cara mia. Challenge accepted." The afternoon brought an unexpected reprieve. Luciana had invited Bianca to join her in the mansion's conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with exotic plants and the gentle sound of water trickling through a small fountain. The space smelled of jasmine and damp earth, creating an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility. "I find gardens therapeutic," Luciana said, pruning dead blooms from a climbing rose with surgical precision. "They require patience, understanding, and sometimes decisive action to maintain their beauty." Bianca understood that nothing about this conversation would be innocent. Luciana moved through the conservatory with the grace of someone comfortable in spaces designed for contemplation and control. "Tell me," Luciana continued, her voice carrying the same cultured authority she had displayed the night before, "what do you think of our home?" "It's beautiful," Bianca replied carefully. "Beautiful, yes, but more importantly, it's secure, safe, a place where those under our protection can find peace." The pruning shears clicked against stems with rhythmic precision. "Of course, protection requires trust, mutual understanding, honesty." Each word carried weight, building towards something that made Bianca's skin prickle with apprehension. "My brother is quite taken with you," Luciana observed, moving to a different plant. "It's unusual. Nico typically finds people predictable, but you've captured his interest in a way that concerns me." "Concerns you?" "Because interest can become obsession, and obsession can cloud judgment." Luciana's dark eyes found hers with sharp intensity. In our family, clouded judgment can be fatal. The conversation was interrupted by rapid footsteps approaching through the mansion's corridors. Marcello burst through the conservatory doors, his usual composed demeanor shattered. Behind him followed Nico, his face dark with barely controlled rage. "We have a problem," Marcello announced without preamble. "A significant problem." Luciana set down her pruning shears, her attention immediately focused on her father. "What's happened?" "Enzo Ferraro has been arrested," Marcello said, his voice carrying the weight of catastrophe. "The FBI picked him up an hour ago on charges of financial fraud and conspiracy." Bianca felt her blood freeze. Enzo Ferraro. She had heard that name whispered in the corridors of Il Veluto, always spoken with the mixture of respect and fear reserved for dangerous men. "Enzo would never break," Luciana said with absolute certainty. "He's been with the family for—" 23 years, Nico interrupted, his voice sharp with betrayal. 23 years of absolute loyalty, until yesterday. He moved to the fountain, his hands gripping its marble edge with white-knuckled intensity. "They didn't arrest him. He walked into their offices voluntarily. He's been cooperating for months." The implications hit the room like a physical force. Bianca watched the family absorb the revelation of betrayal from within their inner circle, saw how it transformed their dynamics from confident authority to defensive uncertainty. "What does he know?" Luciana asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. "Everything," Marcello said quietly. "Financial structures, property acquisitions, personnel decisions, including—" He paused, his weathered face showing his age for the first time since Bianca had met him. "Including details about historical property transfers. The Rinaldi family." They were talking about the Rinaldi family without saying the name directly, but the implication was clear in the charged silence that followed. "There's more," Nico said, turning from the fountain with predatory focus. "The news story last night wasn't random journalism. It was coordinated. Enzo provided them with documentation, testimony, financial records. He's been building a case for months." Bianca felt the world shift beneath her feet. The investigation that had forced her into this mansion wasn't coincidence. It was orchestrated betrayal from within the Carbone organization itself. "How much time do we have?" Luciana asked with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. "Hours," Marcello replied. "Maybe less. Enzo knows about the harbor properties, the construction contracts, the labor arrangements. Once they verify his information, they'll have enough for federal charges," Nico finished, his voice carrying the bitter taste of recognition. But it was what they weren't saying that terrified Bianca. If Enzo Ferraro knew about historical property transfers, about families that had disappeared from public records, then he might know about survivors, about people who had escaped and hidden themselves in plain sight. He might know about her. "What about our guest?" Luciana asked. Her attention suddenly focused on Bianca with uncomfortable intensity. "If Enzo knows about her presence here—" "He doesn't," Nico said quickly, but his voice carried uncertainty. "She's only been here one night." "That we know of," Marcello corrected grimly. "If she's been under surveillance, if her connection to the restaurant has been documented." Bianca felt the trap closing around her from multiple directions. Not only was she imprisoned by the family that had destroyed hers, but now she was potentially exposed to federal investigation that could reveal her true identity to everyone, including those who wanted her dead. "There's something else," a new voice interrupted from the conservatory entrance. A man in an expensive suit approached, with the careful deference of someone bringing bad news to dangerous people. "The Ferretti family has requested an immediate meeting." Marcello's expression darkened further. "The Ferrettis?" "They claim to have information about Enzo's cooperation. They're offering assistance in containing the situation." Nico's laugh was bitter and sharp. "The Ferrettis smell blood in the water. They're circling like sharks." Bianca understood the implications without needing explanation. The Carbone family's moment of vulnerability had attracted the attention of rivals who saw opportunity in their crisis. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with threats multiplying from every direction. "When do they want to meet?" Luciana asked. Tonight. 8 o'clock. Neutral territory. The Meridian Club. The Meridian Club. Even Bianca had heard of the exclusive establishment where New York's most powerful families conducted business that couldn't be discussed in more public venues. "Set it up," Marcello commanded, then turned his attention back to the immediate crisis. "We need to move assets, secure documentation, and prepare for federal scrutiny that could begin within hours." As the family began coordinating their response to the betrayal, Bianca realized that her own situation had become exponentially more dangerous. She was no longer just hiding from the people who had destroyed her family. She was trapped in the center of a collapsing criminal empire, surrounded by federal investigations and rival families who would eliminate any potential witness without hesitation. The clock that had been counting down to her exposure had suddenly accelerated, and she found herself with less time than ever to escape before the truth destroyed everyone within reach, including herself. "Bianca," Nico's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "For you're coming with us tonight." It wasn't a request. The Meridian Club occupied the top 3 floors of a limestone tower overlooking Central Park, its windows glowing like amber jewels against the darkening Manhattan skyline. Bianca sat in the back of the armored Mercedes, dressed in a midnight blue silk dress that Luciana had selected, elegant enough for the venue, but deliberately understated to avoid drawing attention. "Remember," Nico said as they approached the club's discreet entrance, "you're my consultant, financial analysis. You observe, you listen, but you don't speak unless I indicate otherwise." His cover story was thin but functional. In the world they were entering, everyone understood that dangerous men kept dangerous secrets, and asking too many questions about a consultant's background could prove unhealthy. The Meridian Club's interior was a study in understated power: dark wood, leather the color of dried blood, and oil paintings that had probably been stolen from European museums decades earlier. The air carried the scent of expensive cigars and older money, while conversations conducted in multiple languages created a low hum of international intrigue. They were escorted to a private dining room where the Ferretti family waited with the patience of predators who had already chosen their prey. Vincent Ferretti rose as they entered, a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes like winter ice. Beside him sat his son Marco, younger than Nico but carrying the same aura of controlled violence. "Marcello," Vincent's greeting was cordial but cold. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice." The formal pleasantries masked deadly calculation. Bianca could feel the tension crackling between the two families, like electricity before a storm. "Your message suggested urgency," Marcello replied, taking his seat across from the Ferrettis. "Information about our recent personnel difficulties." "Enzo Ferraro was a valuable asset," Vincent said, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "His cooperation with federal authorities creates complications for everyone in our line of business." Bianca noticed how he emphasized Ferraro, drawing attention to the shared surname despite claiming no family connection. In this world, coincidences were usually messages. "The question," Marco interjected with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes, "is how to contain the damage before it spreads to other operations." Nico leaned back in his chair, his posture radiating dangerous calm. "And I'm sure the Ferretti family has suggestions." "We do." Vincent signaled to a server who produced an envelope with theatrical precision. "Mr. Ferraro documented certain historical property transfers that could prove embarrassing to multiple families." The envelope landed on the table between them like a challenge. Marcello's weathered hands remained steady, but Bianca caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition. "However," Vincent continued, "we've recently acquired some of those documents ourselves. Through private channels, of course." "Of course," Luciana's voice carried deadly silk. "And what would you propose to do with such documentation?" "Ensure it disappears," Marco said with false magnanimity. "Along with any federal interest in historical transactions." The offer was both generous and threatening. The Ferrettis were proposing to solve the Carbonis' immediate problem while simultaneously demonstrating their own reach into law enforcement channels. "In exchange for?" Nico asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the price. Partnership, Vincent replied. Specifically, we'd like to discuss restructuring certain territorial arrangements, harbor access, construction permits, labor arbitration services. Bianca understood that they were negotiating the dismantling of Carbone power under the guise of assistance. The Ferrettis were offering to rescue their rivals from federal prosecution in exchange for absorbing their most profitable operations. Generous terms, Marcello said with diplomatic neutrality. Practical terms, Vincent corrected. The federal investigation will proceed regardless of our intervention, but with proper coordination, we can ensure it focuses on past activities rather than current operations. Marco leaned forward with predatory interest. Of course, such coordination requires trust, transparency, shared information about all parties involved. His gaze flickered toward Bianca for just a moment, but long enough to make his meaning clear. The Ferrettis knew she was more than a financial consultant. Shared information, Nico repeated slowly, his voice carrying warning. For instance, Vincent said with casual menace, any surviving witnesses to historical events might need to be relocated, for their own protection, naturally. The words hit Bianca like ice water. They weren't just discussing business restructuring, they were negotiating her elimination as part of their deal. Luciana placed her hands flat on the table, her rings catching the light like small weapons. That seems premature, we're not even certain such witnesses exist. Oh, but we are certain. Marco smiled with false warmth. Our sources indicate at least one survivor has been active in the restaurant industry. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Rinaldi family operations. Bianca felt the blood drain from her face. They knew. Somehow the Ferrettis had connected her to her family's destruction and were using that knowledge as leverage against the Carbones. Interesting theory, Marcello said carefully. More than theory, Vincent replied, producing a second envelope. We have surveillance photographs, financial records, even voice recordings that establish clear connections between certain current employees and historical victims. The envelope remained unopened between them, but its implications were clear. The Ferrettis possessed evidence that could expose Bianca's identity and force the Carbones to choose between protecting her and preserving their own operations. Nico's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And what would you propose to do with such theoretical evidence? Ensure it serves the cause of justice, Marco said with mock sincerity. Historical crimes deserve historical resolution. Bianca realized she was about to become a bargaining chip in negotiations that would determine whether she lived or died. The Ferrettis were offering to suppress federal investigation in exchange for Carbone territory and her elimination. A package deal that would solve multiple problems simultaneously. But as she listened to the careful dance of threats and proposals, something clicked in her mind. The way Vincent spoke about documentation, about historical records, about evidence that needed to disappear, it reminded her of something her father had taught her about negotiations. Everyone assumes the documents are the weakness, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Every eye at the table turned toward her. Nico's warning glance carried the promise of consequences, but she had already committed to her course of action. The documents aren't the vulnerability, she continued, meeting Vincent Ferretti's ice-cold gaze directly. The timing is. Mr. Ferraro's cooperation began months ago, but the story only broke yesterday. Someone held it back, waiting for the right moment. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a moment of recognition that she had identified something he hadn't intended to reveal. The question isn't who has the documents, Bianca said, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. The question is, who's been controlling when they surface? Who benefited from the timing of last night's revelation? She looked around the table, seeing understanding dawn on the Carbone faces, while the Ferrettis maintained careful neutrality. Someone needed the Carbones destabilized at exactly this moment, someone who could offer solutions to problems they helped create. Her gaze returned to Vincent, someone who had been planning this negotiation for months. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Marcello began to laugh, a sound like winter wind through cemetery trees. Enzo Ferraro, he said quietly. Not a turncoat, a planted asset. Vincent's mask of diplomatic concern finally slipped, revealing something far more dangerous beneath. Clever girl. But cleverness can be a fatal character flaw. Can it? Bianca asked, her voice carrying newfound confidence. Because I'm wondering what other planted assets you might have in federal law enforcement, what other investigations you might be controlling, what other evidence you might be manipulating. She had identified the real game, not just leverage over the Carbonis, but control over the entire federal investigation. The Ferrettis weren't just opportunistic rivals, they were the architects of the crisis they now offered to solve. You've exposed your hand, she continued, addressing Vincent directly. The question now is whether the FBI will appreciate learning that their key witness has been feeding them information designed to eliminate your competition rather than pursue actual justice. Vincent's eyes had gone from ice-cold to volcanic. You're suggesting we orchestrated federal cooperation? I'm suggesting that evidence of such orchestration might be very valuable to the right people, Bianca replied, almost as valuable as silence. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. What had begun as the Ferrettis dictating terms to a weakened rival had become a confrontation where their own vulnerability was exposed. Nico was staring at her with something between admiration and disbelief. In the space of 5 minutes, she had transformed from potential victim to the person who might have just saved his family's empire. The ride back to the Carbone compound passed in tense silence, broken only by the low hum of encrypted phone calls as Marcello coordinated damage control with contacts across the city. Bianca sat between Nico and Luciana, feeling the weight of what she had just accomplished, and the dangerous attention it had earned her. Impressive work, Luciana said quietly, her voice carrying grudging respect. You identified their strategy before any of us recognized the pattern. But there was something else in her tone, a note of calculation that made Bianca's skin prickle with unease. She had proven herself valuable to the Carbone family, but value could be as dangerous as worthlessness in their world. The question now, Marcello said, ending his latest call, is how to use what you've discovered without destroying ourselves in the process. Nico turned toward Bianca, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights streaming past their windows. Exposing the Ferrettis' manipulation of federal investigation could clear us of current charges, but it would also reveal how deeply we understand their operations. That knowledge makes us either valuable allies or dangerous enemies. And dangerous enemies have short life expectancies, Luciana added with clinical precision. As they passed through the compound's gates, Bianca noticed increased security, additional guards, new camera positions, and vehicles she didn't recognize positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. The evening's revelations had elevated their threat level considerably. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was electric with crisis management. Staff moved with urgent efficiency, while family advisors huddled in small groups, their conversations conducted in the kind of whispers that preceded either victory or catastrophe. The immediate priority, Marcello announced as they gathered in his private study, is controlling the narrative before the Ferrettis realize how much we know. Maps of the city covered his massive desk, marked with colored pins that indicated territories, assets, and potential threats. The visual representation made clear how much the Carbone family had to lose, and how carefully the Ferrettis had positioned themselves to claim those losses. We have perhaps 12 hours before Vincent realizes his mistake in revealing their strategy, Luciana said, studying the tactical display. After that, he'll either offer us genuine partnership or eliminate us entirely. Nico moved to the windows overlooking the courtyard, his posture tense with barely controlled energy. There's another problem. If we expose the Ferretti's federal manipulation, we also expose Enzo's real allegiances. That makes him a dead man. Enzo chose his side, Marcello replied without sentiment. His survival is no longer our concern. But Bianca heard something in Nico's voice that suggested the betrayal had cut deeper than professional disappointment. Enzo Ferraro had been more than an associate. He had been trusted family, and his deception represented a wound that would be slow to heal. There's something else, she said quietly, drawing their attention. If the Ferrettis have been planning this manipulation for months, they've probably prepared contingencies for exposure. They won't be surprised that we figured it out. They'll be ready for our response." The observation landed in the room like a cold wind. Everyone understood that their moment of tactical advantage might be shorter than they had assumed. "What are you suggesting?" Luciana asked. "I'm suggesting that everything we've discovered tonight might be exactly what they wanted us to discover. That our entire conversation at the Meridian Club was orchestrated to give us information they needed us to have." The implications were staggering. If Bianca was correct, then their apparent victory in exposing Ferretti's strategy was actually another layer of manipulation, designed to push them toward responses that would serve their enemies' ultimate goals. "A chess game within a chess game," Marcello said slowly, his weathered face showing the strain of contemplating such elaborate deception. "Which means," Nico concluded, "that everything we're planning to do next has probably been anticipated and counted in advance." Bianca felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Her strategic insight had saved them from immediate danger, but revealed threats far more complex than anyone had imagined. A soft knock interrupted their planning. One of the household staff entered with careful deference, carrying an envelope sealed with black wax. "This arrived by messenger," she said, placing it on Marcello's desk with the reverence reserved for potentially explosive devices. Marcello broke the seal with steady hands, but his expression darkened as he read the contents. Without a word, he passed the letter to Nico, whose jaw tightened with each line. "What is it?" Luciana demanded. "A formal business proposal," Nico said, his voice carrying bitter humor. "The Ferrettis are offering to purchase our harbor properties at fair market value. They're also requesting exclusive rights to our construction permits and labor arrangements." "Everything we discussed tonight," Bianca observed. "Exactly what they tried to negotiate at the club." "With one addition," Marcello said grimly. "They're also requesting that we transfer custody of any personnel connected to historical property disputes, for their protection, naturally." The meaning was clear. They wanted Bianca delivered to them as part of the business arrangement. "The deadline for our response is 48 hours, Nico continued reading, "after which they'll be forced to pursue alternative resolution methods." "Alternative resolution methods," Luciana repeated with dark amusement. How diplomatically they phrased threats of annihilation. Bianca realized that her moment of tactical brilliance had actually accelerated the Ferrettis' timeline rather than disrupting their plans. They were no longer interested in subtle manipulation. They were making direct demands backed by the threat of immediate violence. "We have a choice," Marcello said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We can comply with their demands and preserve what remains of our operations, or we can fight and risk losing everything." "Including our consultant," Luciana added, her gaze finding Bianca with uncomfortable intensity. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them like fog. Bianca understood that her value to the family was now balanced against their survival as an organization. She had become simultaneously their greatest asset and their most dangerous liability. "There's a third option," she said quietly. "Which is?" Nico asked. "We change the game entirely, stop playing by rules they established and start creating our own." Marcello's eyes sharpened with interest. "Explain." "Everything they've done assumes we'll respond predictably, either submit to their demands or fight them directly. But what if we do neither? What if we expose their federal manipulation publicly, force them to deal with consequences they haven't prepared for?" "That would destroy us along with them," Luciana pointed out. "Maybe," Bianca acknowledged, "or maybe it would level the playing field enough for us to build something new from the wreckage." She looked around the room at faces that reflected decades of accumulated power and influence, understanding that she was asking them to risk everything on the strategy of someone they had known for less than 2 days. "The question," she continued, "is whether you trust me enough to bet your empire on my judgment." The silence that followed was absolute, filled with the weight of a decision that would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of everything the Carbone family had built over generations. Dawn brought unexpected clarity to the mansion's war room. Bianca stood before the massive desk where maps and financial documents created a tactical mosaic of New York's power structure, but her posture had transformed overnight. Gone was the careful deference of a protected guest. In its place was the bearing of someone who understood her own value and intended to dictate its terms. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "we need to establish ground rules." Marcello looked up from the intelligence reports he had been studying since before sunrise. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night spent calculating odds and consequences, but his attention was sharp and focused. "Ground rules?" Luciana asked from her position by the windows, where she had been monitoring the increased security presence outside. "Conditions," Bianca clarified, moving to the center of the room where everyone could see her clearly. "If I'm going to risk my life implementing this strategy, I need guarantees about how that risk will be managed." Nico emerged from the shadows near the fireplace, his dark eyes reflecting something between admiration and wariness. "You're in no position to make demands." "Aren't I?" Bianca's smile carried steel beneath silk. "Yesterday I was a liability you needed to protect. Today I'm the person with a plan that might save your family's empire. That's a significant change in leverage." She moved to the desk, her fingers tracing the territorial boundaries marked on the city map. "The Ferrettis expect you to respond emotionally, either surrender out of fear or attack out of pride. But emotion is a luxury you can't afford right now." "And what do you propose instead?" Marcello asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. "Cold calculation, strategic thinking. A recognition that the old rules of engagement have changed permanently." She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes with steady confidence. "But that requires trusting someone who isn't bound by the traditions that made you vulnerable in the first place." Luciana moved away from the windows, her expression skeptical. "You're suggesting we abandon methods that have maintained our power for decades?" "I'm suggesting that your methods have been compromised by people who studied them for years before implementing their own strategy." Bianca pulled a chair to the desk and sat down without invitation, claiming space in their council of war. "Enzo Ferraro didn't betray you impulsively. He was cultivated, turned, and deployed as part of a long-term plan." The observation hit the room like cold water. Everyone understood the implications, but hearing them stated so directly forced a reckoning with how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. "So, what are your conditions?" Nico asked, settling into the chair across from her. "First, complete transparency about what you know regarding my family's destruction. No more games, no more testing my reactions. If we're going to work together, I need to understand exactly what happened 10 years ago." Marcello's weathered face revealed nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. "Second, when this is over, assuming we survive, I walk away clean. No obligations, no debts, no expectations of continued association." "And third," Luciana prompted, "third, during the operation, my decisions regarding tactics and timing are final. No second guessing, no committee decisions, no family politics interfering with execution." The demands were audacious for someone who had been their prisoner less than 48 hours earlier, but Bianca understood that audacity was the only currency that mattered in their world. "Interesting terms," Marcello said slowly. "And what do we receive in exchange for such unprecedented autonomy?" "Victory," Bianca replied simply. "Not survival, not compromise, not negotiated surrender. Complete victory that eliminates the Ferretti threat permanently, while positioning you to absorb their operations." She stood and moved to the map, her finger tracing routes through Manhattan's financial district. "But victory requires accepting that everything you thought you knew about this conflict is wrong." "Explain," Nico commanded, his attention laser-focused on her movements. "You've been treating this as a territorial dispute between criminal organizations, but it's actually a corporate takeover, disguised as a gang war." She pointed to specific locations on the map: banks, investment firms, construction companies. "The Ferrettis haven't been building street-level muscle. They've been acquiring legitimate businesses that interface with your operations." The implications were staggering. Traditional mob warfare focused on violence and intimidation, But the Ferrettis had been conducting a financial siege that bypassed those defenses entirely. "They don't need to destroy you through force," Bianca continued. "They just need to control enough legitimate businesses to strangle your revenue streams. Banks that handle your money, construction companies that bid on your projects, unions that supply your labor." "Which is why the federal investigation was so perfectly timed," Luciana observed with growing understanding. "It wasn't meant to destroy us legally. It was meant to panic us into making decisions that would accelerate their financial takeover." "Exactly." Bianca returned to the desk, pulling out a calculator and legal pad. "But if we understand their real strategy, we can turn it against them." She began writing numbers, addresses, company names, financial relationships that formed the hidden architecture of the Ferretti's plan. "Instead of responding to their ultimatum about territorial concessions, we attack their legitimate business network. Corporate audits, SEC investigations, labor disputes, regulatory challenges." She looked up from her calculations. "We use the law against them the same way they've been using it against you." Marcello leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Fighting fire with fire. Fighting sophistication with sophistication," Bianca corrected. "But it requires resources, connections, and most importantly, precise timing. One mistake, one premature move, and they'll realize what we're doing in time to counter." "And you believe you can coordinate such a complex operation?" Luciana asked. "I believe I can coordinate it better than anyone else in this room," Bianca replied with quiet confidence. "Because I'm the only one here who isn't emotionally invested in maintaining traditional power structures." The silence that followed was filled with calculation. She was asking them to gamble everything on the judgment of someone they barely knew, someone whose true identity remained partially mysterious. "There's one more condition," she said quietly. "Which is?" Nico asked. "When this is over, you tell me exactly how my father died. Not the sanitized version, not the strategic justification. The truth. All of it." Nico's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly. "Agreed." Marcello studied her face for a long moment before speaking. "You have your autonomy, but understand that if your strategy fails, the consequences will be permanent for everyone in this room." "I understand," Bianca replied. "But if we do nothing, the consequences are guaranteed to be permanent anyway." She pulled the phone toward her and began dialing the first number on her list. "We have 36 hours before their deadline expires. I suggest we get started." As she waited for the connection, Bianca felt the weight of leadership settling over her like armor. For the first time since her family's destruction, she was no longer reacting to other people's plans. She was creating her own, and the fate of everyone who had destroyed her world now rested in her hands. The war room had transformed into a command center that hummed with controlled urgency. 3 banks of computers displayed real-time financial data, while encrypted phone lines carried conversations in multiple languages as Bianca's strategy unfolded across the city, like a precisely orchestrated symphony of destruction. "Meridian Construction just failed their safety inspection," Luciana reported from her station, satisfaction evident in her voice. "The violations are extensive enough to shut down their harbor project indefinitely." "Ferretti Holdings received an SEC audit notice 20 minutes ago," Nico added, his fingers flying across a keyboard as he monitored financial markets. "Someone leaked information about their offshore accounting practices." Bianca stood at the center of the operation, her attention divided between multiple screens, while she coordinated attacks across a dozen different fronts. The evening dress had been replaced by a simple black suit that made her look like exactly what she had become, a general commanding a bloodless war. "Phase 2 initiates in 15 minutes, she announced, checking her watch. "The labor disputes at their construction sites need to begin simultaneously with the banking irregularities investigation. Timing is everything," Marcello observed from his position near the fireplace, his weathered face reflecting grudging admiration for the precision of her operation. 32 hours ago, you were serving water. Now you're dismantling an empire through paperwork." "Education," Bianca replied without looking away from her screens. "My father taught me that the most effective weapons are often the least obvious ones." The mention of her father sent a ripple of tension through the room, but she had moved past the need for emotional protection. Her identity was no longer a secret to be guarded, but a source of strength to be leveraged. "Incoming call from Vincent Ferretti," one of the technicians announced. "Put it through," Bianca commanded, activating the speaker system. Vincent's voice filled the room with cold fury. "I assume you're behind the unfortunate coincidences affecting our business operations today." "I'm not sure what you mean," Bianca replied with perfect calm. "Though I understand various regulatory agencies have suddenly become interested in corporate governance practices throughout the city. This is a mistake, girl. You're playing a game you don't understand." "On the contrary," Bianca said, her voice carrying new authority, "I understand it perfectly. The question is whether you're prepared for the consequences of having taught me the rules." She gestured to Nico, who activated another computer screen displaying the Ferretti family's financial network. Red indicators marked each company currently under investigation or regulatory review. "Your strategy was brilliant," Bianca continued, her tone conversational despite the deadly nature of their exchange. "Using legitimate businesses to strangle criminal operations while maintaining plausible deniability. Unfortunately for you, legitimate businesses are vulnerable to legitimate oversight." "You can't sustain this level of regulatory attention," Vincent replied, but something in his voice suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of what they faced. "Can't I?" Bianca pulled up another screen showing news feeds from financial journalism outlets. Curious how many reporters have suddenly become interested in stories about construction industry corruption, offshore banking irregularities, and labor dispute patterns. The media offensive had been the final piece of her strategy, not just regulatory pressure, but public attention that would make any counterattack by the Ferrettis visible and documented. "You're destroying yourself along with us," Vincent said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Am I?" Bianca asked, genuine curiosity in her tone. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm eliminating threats to stable business operations throughout the city." She nodded to Luciana, who activated a conference call connection to additional parties. "Vincent, I'd like you to meet some people," Bianca said as new voices joined the conversation. Deputy Director Sarah Chen from the SEC, Assistant U.S., Attorney Michael Torres, and investigative journalist Patricia Reyes from the Financial Tribune. The silence that followed was absolute. Vincent Ferretti, who had spent months maneuvering for advantage through subtlety and misdirection, suddenly found himself exposed to the very authorities he had been manipulating. "Ms. Rinaldi has been very helpful in understanding certain patterns of corporate manipulation," Deputy Director Chen said with professional courtesy, "particularly regarding the coordination between seemingly independent business entities." "Rinaldi?" Vincent's voice carried shock and dawning recognition. "Yes," Bianca replied quietly. "Alessandro Rinaldi's daughter. The survivor you spent months hunting without realizing she was hiding in plain sight." She moved to the window overlooking the courtyard, where afternoon light cast everything in sharp relief. "My father taught me that the best revenge isn't violence. It's justice delivered through proper channels. The federal investigation you've been manipulating has been redirected," Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres added. "We're now focusing on corporate entities that have been using criminal organizations as proxies for legitimate business objectives. Which means," journalist Patricia Reyes concluded, "that tomorrow's headlines will be very interesting reading for anyone involved in construction industry irregularities." Vincent's breathing was audible through the speaker system, but he remained silent as the implications settled over him like a closing net. "You have a choice," Bianca said, her voice carrying the same authority her father had once wielded. "You can continue fighting a battle you've already lost, or you can begin negotiating the terms of your withdrawal from operations that no longer belong to you." "What terms?" Vincent asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Complete divestiture of all construction and harbor-related holdings, immediate cessation of federal investigation manipulation, and formal acknowledgement that historical property disputes have been resolved through appropriate legal channels." The terms were total surrender disguised as business negotiation. Vincent Ferretti, who had entered this conflict confident of victory, was being offered the opportunity to retreat with minimal losses rather than face complete destruction. And if I refuse, then tomorrow's news cycle will be very educational for law enforcement agencies throughout the northeastern United States. Patricia Reyes replied with professional enthusiasm. I'm particularly excited about the series on offshore banking practices. Bianca returned to her position at the Central Command Station, where screens continued to display the systematic dismantling of Ferretti operations across the city. You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision, she said quietly. After that, the story publishes regardless of your cooperation. She disconnected the call and turned to face the Carbone family, who had watched her dismantle their enemies through legal maneuvering rather than violence. It's over, she announced, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. By this time tomorrow, the Ferretti threat will be eliminated permanently, and your operations will be more secure than they've been in years. Marcello approached slowly, his weathered face reflecting something between respect and wariness. You've accomplished in 36 hours what we couldn't achieve in months of traditional response. Because I fought them on ground they hadn't prepared for, Bianca replied. They expected criminal retaliation, not corporate warfare conducted through legitimate channels. Nico moved behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. And now? Now you keep your promise? She said quietly, turning to meet his dark gaze. You tell me exactly how my father died. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Victory had been achieved, enemies had been defeated, but the truth about her family's destruction remained the final price to be paid for her assistance. In the silence that followed, Bianca understood that some answers were more dangerous than the questions that preceded them. The private library of the Carbone mansion felt different in the golden light of evening. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of knowledge accumulated over generations. But tonight, this sanctuary of family history would witness the revelation of truths that had been buried for a decade. Bianca sat in a wingback chair that faced the massive fireplace, where flames cast dancing shadows across the Persian carpet. Across from her, Nico occupied a matching chair, while Marcello stood near the windows with the bearing of a man preparing to confess sins that had shaped his legacy. Your father, Marcello began, his voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed memory, was the most honorable man I ever tried to destroy. The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that made Bianca's breath catch in her throat. She had expected justifications, strategic explanations, anything except an admission of regret from a man who had never shown vulnerability. Alessandro Rinaldi understood something that took me decades to learn, Marcello continued, moving away from the windows to pace before the fireplace. That true power comes not from fear, but from respect, earned through consistent honor. Bianca's hands gripped the chair's leather arms, her knuckles white with tension. Then why did you kill him? Because, Nico said quietly, someone convinced us he was planning to betray family traditions to federal authorities. Someone? Bianca's voice carried deadly calm. Enzo Ferraro, Marcello replied, the name bitter on his tongue. Even then, he was feeding us information designed to serve Ferretti interests rather than truth. The revelation struck Bianca like ice water. Her family had been destroyed not through genuine betrayal, but through manipulation, by the same enemies she had just defeated through strategic brilliance. Enzo provided documents, recordings, evidence that seemed to prove your father was cooperating with federal investigation into our operations, Nico continued, his dark eyes reflecting pain that went deeper than professional regret. Everything appeared authentic, corroborated by sources we trusted. But it was fabricated, Bianca said, though the words felt like shards of glass in her throat. Elaborately fabricated, Marcello confirmed. Enzo spent months creating false evidence, building a case that would convince us to eliminate the Rinaldi family, while believing we were protecting ourselves. Bianca closed her eyes, feeling the weight of wasted years, of anger directed at the wrong targets, of a life built around vengeance that had been misdirected from its inception. The night of the attack, Nico said softly, Your father faced us with complete dignity. He didn't beg, didn't bargain, didn't claim innocence in the way guilty men do. He simply asked that his family be spared. And you refused. I was 23. Nico's voice carried the rawness of confession. Young, angry, convinced that mercy was weakness. I participated because I thought it was necessary, because I believed the evidence, because I trusted people who were manipulating us all. Marcello moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Your father gave me this before he died. He said it belonged to his daughter, and that someday she would need it to reclaim what was rightfully hers. He placed the box on the table between them. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay her mother's wedding ring, a simple band of gold set with a small diamond that had belonged to 5 generations of Rinaldi women. He knew I would survive, Bianca whispered, touching the ring with trembling fingers. He planned your survival, Marcello corrected. Every detail of that night was choreographed to ensure you would escape. The hidden passage, the timing of the guards, even Matteo's presence at the restaurant, all of it was arranged by your father before we arrived. The truth hit her with devastating clarity. Her father hadn't just protected her through quick thinking. He had orchestrated her escape with the same strategic brilliance she had inherited and used against his enemies. Matteo was his man, she said, understanding finally dawning. Always, Nico confirmed. He placed Matteo at Il Veluto years before, knowing that if anything happened to your family, you would eventually surface in the restaurant industry. Matteo has been watching for you ever since. Bianca slipped her mother's ring onto her finger, where it fit perfectly despite the decade that had passed. The weight of it felt like absolution and armor combined. The question now, Marcello said quietly, is what you intend to do with this knowledge. She stood and moved to the fireplace, watching flames consume wood in patterns that reminded her of the night her world had burned. But instead of pain, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 10 years, peace. I intend to honor his memory, she said, turning to face them with transformed composure, by building something worthy of the sacrifice he made. And your plans for revenge. Complete, Bianca replied with quiet satisfaction. I've destroyed the people responsible for my family's death. The fact that they happened to be your enemies rather than you simply means justice took a more circuitous route. She moved to the massive desk and pulled out a legal document she had prepared during the afternoon's operations. Il Veluto is being transferred back to Rinaldi ownership, effective immediately. The property disputes that began this entire conflict have been resolved through proper legal channels. Marcello studied the document with expressions that cycled through surprise, understanding, and finally something approaching admiration. You're reclaiming your inheritance, he observed. I'm reclaiming my identity, Bianca corrected. Bianca Rinaldi, daughter of Alessandro, heir to traditions worth preserving and power worth wielding responsibly. She turned to Nico, who had been watching her with intense focus throughout the conversation. Your family's debt to mine is paid. My father's honor has been restored. His enemies have been destroyed, and his daughter has reclaimed what belongs to her. And our association, Nico asked, rising to face her, continues, she said with a smile that carried both warmth and challenge, but as equals, partners, if you prefer. I have a restaurant empire to rebuild, and you have family operations that would benefit from the kind of strategic thinking that just eliminated the Ferretti threat. She moved closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the tension that had been building between them since that first night at Il Veluto. Besides, she said softly, someone needs to teach you how to fight wars without bullets, how to build power through respect rather than fear, how to create legacies that honor the past while transforming the future. Nico's smile was slow and predatory, but warmed by something deeper than mere attraction. And you believe you're qualified to provide such education? I believe, Bianca replied, placing her hand against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat strong and steady, that I just proved myself more than qualified. As the fire crackled in the grate, and evening light faded beyond the windows, Bianca Rinaldi stood in the library of her former enemies, wearing her mother's ring and her father's legacy, no longer hiding in shadows, but claiming her place as an equal among those who shaped the city's hidden power structures. The girl who had served water in silence had become the woman who commanded empires through wisdom, and the game that had begun with humiliation had ended with coronation. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story today. Subscribe for more, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.